I will probably never know why my ancestors came over from the old world, but I believe that it was a choice made willingly. There appears to have been a genuine hope for a new life here. I believe this because the circumstances and events that formed our family history during this time seem to speak so loudly of the loss of such a hope and easily explain the reason for the accompanying anger, violence, and notoriety that would find a place in our country's history books. I can only imagine how it must have felt to have crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a ship with babes in arms, only to find that you have been lied to, and the world that was supposed to be the new start was simply the same old bigotry and discrimination that was thought to be left behind. And worse yet, as the familiarity of family and peers would be entirely absent. Unfamiliar and unforgiving circumstances would force my forefather to join the war effort in defending his new country against a supposed attack from the Americans. This meant leaving his wife and children to fend for themselves in the Irish ghetto known as Corktown. But there was a promise of 100 acres of land to anyone who joined. So for a year and a half he served in the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles until this unit was rendered obsolete and disbanded in June of 1816. The short story goes that when he found out that the governing body was now reneging on the promise of land, a crime of violence was committed, after which he gathered his entire family and everything they owned and fled upriver into the wilderness. They would eventually settle in a remote area conveniently located on the French side of the river to avoid British jurisdictional law. This area was known only as Sheen, a French word describing the massive stand of oak trees that grew there. Here my family toiled, harvesting the unyielding oaks. The raw logs were felled, then hewn square by hand, and hauled to the frozen riverbeds to await the spring thaw, where they would be floated downriver to market. The French would come to call them Chinois, the people of the oaks. On the British side, they became known as the infamous Shiners.
Waje kudushaka utaziyo twerekeye, waje kudushaka utazi kuzatubona, waje kudushaka ma.
In Sheen, the only thing in less abundance than resources was law and order. So the rule of might is right was firmly in place. Keeping in the tradition of a Kerry boy, J.P. Sullivan enforced his will at the end of a shillelagh. The Shiner faction became so well known for their prowess with this humble Irish weapon that the shillelagh became part of their identifying mark, the Shiner S, a simple glyph pounded into the side of their logs, an unmistakable calling card that was easily read by all. This is Shiner timber. Pilferers will be beat to death, and indeed, many were. This same moniker adorns the gravestones of all the Sullivan men who headed the Shiner faction over the next 2 centuries. In the spring, the riverbeds would thaw, and the logs would be perilously driven down the smaller tributaries to the main water, and then lashed into cribs of 20 logs each. These cribs were then in turn lashed into giant rafts that would be floated 100 miles downriver into Bytown to be sold. These floating villages were the scene of many violent altercations between factions, as they all tried to be the first one downriver while the water was high. It was here that the Shiners made their name as the most formidable fighting faction on the river. Their notoriety as fighters would be sought out by the organized criminal element in Bytown, and the Shiners were often hired exclusively as enforcers for these groups. As the Sullivan Shiners' reputation grew, they began to stylize and personalize their methodology with their weapon of choice. The name Sullivan in Gaelic means one-eyed, and so it became our faction's signature when fighting to focus on the removal of the opponent's eye. This would certainly end the fight, as well as leave a very clear visual reminder to others of the consequences of crossing a Shiner. This creative tendency would result in the head of our faction becoming known as the One-Eyed Jack, and consequently began our personal family style, as well as a naming tradition that is maintained to this very day.